A good friend of mine's birthday is soon coming up and I wanted to make a suitable gift. Now he's a big Warhammer 40,000 fan, so I wanted to do something along those lines. Now I only had a week to put this together, so I started thinking, well, what can I actually do? And as you may have noticed on my channel recently, I've been casting up some skulls, so I instantly thought of a Servo Skull from Warhammer 40,000. For those of you that don't know, these are sort of cybernetically enhanced skulls that float about the battlefield and sort of act as scouts and sort of probes, so think along the lines of the Imperial probe droid from Star Wars, just as a skull instead. So I thought this would be quite a cool project. I only had a week to put this together, so I had to sort of keep my ambitions fairly sensible. One trap I often fall into is making my projects way too complicated, so keeping things achievable was actually quite a good thing for this project. So I took one of the casts from the skulls that I'd made and started gathering all sorts of bits and pieces that I could use to add to the skull. Now one thing I had been given was a box of old security cameras a while back. I've got about 24 of these, but they're really cool. They've got this sort of sliding lens which is pretty cool. So what I decided to do was to use this for the main eye socket. And I think this is going to look pretty good with a red LED shining through it. And I've also got a lot of other cast resin pieces that I've cast up for various other projects. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is actually cut a hole in the skull to allow the camera to fit inside. So I'm just roughly marking the shape of the camera on the side of the skull. Now luckily this step drill bit is almost exactly the right size for the camera, so the first thing I can do is to drill a hole into the eye socket here. It's a bit of a tight fit, so I need to actually widen that out with a Dremel. The skull's made from polyurethane resin, so it's quite easy to sand down, and so it's actually quite a nice material to work with. Right, there we go, so that fits in quite nicely there. So what I can now do is start thinking about adding additional pieces to the skull. Now one thing I was thinking about doing was using this, which is a cast of a yoghurt pot which I'd used for a previous project. I was thinking this could look quite nice on the back of the skull, but after playing around with it a little bit, it didn't really work out. So what I'm going to do is just start adding pieces onto the skull in a sort of a relatively random fashion. I'm just going to keep trying to build up a sort of a mechanical looking layout here. The intention is to make it look like this is sort of intentional and there's a purpose to all of these pieces, and that's sort of part of the fun with this really. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle but without any instructions. Now this metal piece I've got here is a aluminium ring from inside a VCR. I've cut off some of the additional pieces that were attached to it, but I think that's going to look quite nice on the side. I've also got this piece which I can put in the back, and this is made out of a piece from a hard drive and some bolts, so I think that's going to look quite nice on the back of the skull. I'm only using this white version for a test fit, and I've had a black version curing in the mould while I've been doing this, so I can swap that out. I want to keep the natural colour of all of these pieces as closely as possible, so having things black is pretty useful, because if I do decide to paint them and they get chipped, well, you'll only see black showing through rather than white. Well, that's looking good so far. So what I want to do is have this mounted on a base. So I've got a piece of aluminium wire coming out the back here, and I'm going to attach that to a wooden base. The aluminium can bend, so it allows the piece to be posed however I need. What I also want to do is have some sort of tentacles coming off the side and some sort of grasping arms. So I've got some conduit here with some thinner aluminium wire inside as well. So I'm going to attach all of these pieces to the back of the skull. Now before I go too far in this, I'm actually going to give the skull a bit of a paint job, and I'm doing exactly the same thing I did for my previous skull video. I'm just covering the whole thing in burnt umber and then wiping it away using a bit of white spirit, and that should give the skull a nice bone-like colour. Now I need to secure all of these pieces of wire into the back of the skull, and it's all quite irregularly shaped surfaces, so how do you go about attaching these things together? Well, I have put a bolt into the back of the skull, but in order to make this really secure, what I'm going to do is mix up some of this epoxy clay, which is called Freeform Sculpt from Smooth On. And this stuff dries incredibly hard, so I find this really useful for sort of attaching very awkward pieces together. So what I'm going to do is mix up a ball of epoxy and then embed the pieces of aluminium in that epoxy against the skull, and that should hold them quite securely. So it's always slightly awkward working inside a small space and also filming it at the same time. But what I really need to do is just encase all of these pieces of aluminium in the epoxy, so when it dries it will hold them secure. This stuff comes with some detailing agent, which is just like a thin fluid that allows you to smooth out the epoxy, so that's quite useful just for pushing it into place. So what I also want to do is use some of this conduit to add some piping detail onto the skull. And this stuff's really useful. It's 4.5mm conduit, so it's relatively small scale as far as conduit goes. So what I'm doing is just trying to push this into the existing mechanical detail that I've already got and find something that looks quite natural. So I'm thinking I can feed the conduit across the skull here and then terminate it into this sort of resin shape that I've got stuck on the other side. And what I've also got are these cable clips, which just happen to be exactly the right size, so they're really useful. So what I can do is drill a hole in the skull and then just push the nail into the skull, and that will hold quite nicely, so there's not actually any need for glue or anything like that. So I quite like the look of that, but I think I also need something on the other side of the skull. So what I've got is this thing which I made for a project a while back, and it's a sort of a round sort of junction thing with some spaces for some bolts. So I'm just going to glue that on the side, and that can sit there, and I'll try and figure out what I'm going to actually do with it later. Like I said, part of the fun of this is really just making it up as you go along and trying to come up with something that looks like a sort of a cohesive whole out of all of these disparate parts. Not quite sure exactly what I'm going to do with this piece. One thing I'm considering is sort of running a cable around the edge. One little trick I have found useful on various other projects is if you're not quite sure how to terminate an edge against something, so if it's got a bit of a rough edge or if the two sides don't meet particularly well, what you can do is run a cable along that edge to sort of hide that join. So that's one possible way I might deal with this, but I'll see how things pan out. Right, so now this thing wouldn't be complete without having some lighting in it, so I'm going to be using some 12V LEDs as I have on a number of other projects previously. What I'm doing here is just soldering up a breadboard, and this is very, very simple. There's just two strips, one of them's negative, one of them's positive. So all I do is just take my LEDs and connect the red and the black wires up to the correct bars. That just works, so that's a nice simple circuit, and using a breadboard just keeps everything neat. Now I want a big red LED for the main eye lens, but I can't resist having a few flickering orange LEDs in this as well. I love these things, they look really, really nice in pretty much everything you put them in. And in a similar way to the retro robot I made a while back, I'm sort of thinking this could be a sort of a lighting feature in a room. So having this sort of warm flickering orange is almost a bit like candlelight, so it's quite a gentle light and it's really atmospheric, so I think it's going to look really nice with this. Now I've had to wait a few days for my red LED to show up, so this thing has sort of been sitting on the side, sort of annoyingly incomplete until that light actually shown up, but it's shown up now, so I'm just soldering on the final LED here. And once that's in place I'll be able to light up the main lighting feature for this piece. Right, there we go. So that's pretty cool. That's the sort of one sort of main thing that Servo Skulls all seem to have in common. They all seem to have a really bright red eye, so that's pretty cool. So I like the look of that. And the cool thing here is that the focusing ring on the camera still works, so that's quite a nice little feature as well. One other thing I hadn't realised is that the orange LEDs were going to shine through the skull, so I hadn't anticipated that, but it actually looks really, really cool, so I'm quite pleased that that's happened. So what I'm doing here is making the base for the sculpture. Now what I've done is to cut out a piece of wood and then to cover it in styrene plastic. I've done this on numerous projects previously, and I find it a really nice way of getting a smooth finish onto some wood. So I'm nearing the end of this, so I'm just adding some additional cabling on top too to add a bit more detail. And I found quite a nice way of hiding the join between the main conduit that's covering the stem of the skull, was to actually feed these smaller conduits into it. So that works quite well, I think. Makes it look like maybe part of the spinal cord or something like that. Right, so now that I've got all the electronics finalised, what I'm doing is just covering the circuit board in hot glue. That's just to make sure nothing comes apart. I mean, it shouldn't do. It's not something that's going to be chucked about too much, or at least I hope it won't be. But just to make sure that nothing comes loose and so the lights stop working, I'm just covering all that in hot glue. That way nothing can go wrong. Obviously, you need to make sure your electronics are working before you do this, so only do it if you're confident that everything's okay. And the last thing I need to do is to make some end stops for these tentacles. So I'm just making a sort of little lens thing here. And what I'm doing here is actually laying some resin down. The resin is relatively soft, so it's very easy to work with. And I find this a really useful way of quickly making sort of small round objects for pieces like this. Something that looks pretty cool in the end there. And finally, what I've got here are two casts. These are from the fingers from my green female robot that I made a while back, and I think they can look pretty cool attached to the sides like that. So that's just a final little grabby claw for this thing, so it can manipulate objects and obviously do the Emperor's bidding. So that's the final aspect of this. Right, so there we go, that was a fun little project. This took about 3 or 4 evenings to do and a Sunday afternoon, so I thought that was pretty good. Having a tight deadline does sort of rein you in a little bit and sort of forces you to be creative. So this was a really fun short-term project, and it really just goes to show how versatile skulls are. I've used these things for several projects now, so yeah, really useful to have a skull mould. So if you don't have one, I thoroughly recommend making one. Okay, so I think that's it for this one. I hope this was interesting and useful, but for the time being, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.